Kings are remembered in statues and songs carved in marble, celebrated in ballads, immortalized in the gold leaf of illuminated manuscripts. But not all deserve their glory. Some were cruel beyond measure, others careless beyond excuse, and a few so reckless, so driven by vanity or madness or naked ambition, that their own thrones collapsed beneath the weight of their failures. From palaces dripping with gold to battlefields soaked in blood, history tells the stories of rulers who became warnings, instead of legends, men who wore the crown but could not carry its responsibility, who held the scepter but never understood its purpose. Tonight, we journey through the darkness of their reigns, the worst kings in history, and the long shadows they cast across the civilizations they were trusted to protect. These are not stories of ordinary failure. These are stories of catastrophic, world-altering collapse. Stories of paranoia that consumed empires, of madness that tore kingdoms apart, of VIII that burned down cities and executed innocent men, of weakness that invited foreign conquest, and of cruelty so extreme that it echoed through centuries as a warning to every ruler who came after. So before you get comfortable tonight, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Legacy of Throne, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments. Drop your current city or country and your local time. It is always wonderful to see who is joining us from every corner of the world. Whether you are listening from London at midnight, from Sydney in the early morning, or from somewhere in between, your presence here matters. Now dim your lights, let the world grow quiet around you, and get comfortable. We begin in silence. The year was 37 CE. The Roman Empire stood at what appeared to be the absolute height of its strength and confidence. From the wind-swept coasts of Britannia in the far northwest to the sun-baked deserts, Egypt in the southeast, from the vineyards of Gaul to the bustling markets of Judea, the empire's reach seemed not merely extensive, but essentially limitless. Rome itself was a city of marble and accumulated power, where senators debated in cool, colonnaded porticos and legionaries marched through the forum with the thunder of iron-shod sandals upon ancient stone. The aqueducts carried fresh water to 1 million citizens. The roads carried armies and merchants across 3 continents. The machinery of empire ground forward with the inexorable confidence of a civilization that had never seriously questioned its own permanence. And into this world of grandeur and expectation stepped Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, known more widely by the nickname Caligula, which meant Little Boots, a title affectionately given when, as a small child, he had wandered the military camps of his father Germanicus, dressed in a miniature soldier's uniform, complete with tiny Caligulae sandals. The troops have Condai adored him then, the charming, curly-haired child of a general they worshipped, a living mascot of the legion's family. Few could have imagined that this same figure, this beloved child of one of Rome's most admired men, would within a few short years be remembered as one of history's most catastrophically destructive rulers, a name that has come down through the centuries as the very archetype of tyrannical insanity. Caligula began his reign with what seemed like genuine transformative promise. After the suspicious death of his predecessor Tiberius, a reign characterized by paranoid treason trials, mass executions of senators, and a general atmosphere of fear that had hung over Rome for 2 decades, the Roman people welcomed Caligula with a joy that bordered on collective euphoria. Tiberius had been stern, reclusive, increasingly sadistic, and had spent the last decade of his reign retreating to his villa on the island of Capri, running the empire through informers and leaving Rome to fester in anxiety. Caligula seemed to be everything Tiberius had not been: young, energetic, personally accessible, apparently generous of spirit, and possessed of a charisma that his father Germanicus had made famous throughout the empire. The first months of his reign appeared to vindicate every hope. He granted generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard and the military, who had adored his father. He staged lavish games in the Circus Maximus chariot races, gladiatorial spectacles, theatrical performances that gave the Roman public weeks of entertainment and celebration. He ordered the release of prisoners who had been condemned under Tiberius's paranoid treason laws. He recalled exiles from the distant islands to which they had been banished. He published the account books of public revenues and expenditures, a gesture of transparency that previous emperors had jealously concealed. Rome, exhausted by suspicion and austerity, seemed to bloom again in the light of a youthful emperor, God who genuinely appeared to promise a golden age. But the tide of admiration turned with terrifying speed. Within the first year of his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill, a fever of some kind, whose specific nature ancient sources do not clearly describe. The court waited in visible anxiety as days passed, and the emperor's condition waxed and waned. When he finally recovered, something in his character appeared altered, as though the fever had burned away whatever restraint had previously contained the more dangerous elements of his personality. Ancient sources, Suetonius in his Lives of the 12 Caesars, Cassius Dio in his Roman history, and the philosopher Seneca, who observed the court firsthand, all describe a discernible shift in his behavior after the illness. Some modern historians have speculated about hyperthyroidism, temporal lobe epilepsy, or the psychological effects of the extreme stress and isolation of imperial power on a young man raised in deeply traumatic circumstance. Others believe the illness simply removed the inhibitions of an emperor who had never been adequately prepared for the responsibilities he was handed. Whatever the truth, the Rome that had once cheered him began first to whisper, and soon to fear. Caligula's extravagance was the first visible symptom of what was coming. He spent with a reckless abandon that had no precedent even in Rome's famously lavish imperial culture, draining the treasury that Tiberius had carefully and parsimoniously accumulated over 23 years. He ordered construction projects that seemed driven less by any civic utility than by pure desire for row. Spectacle ships with gilded hulls and marble dining rooms that floated upon the sea like moving palaces, extravagant games and festivals that consumed days and weeks of public time and enormous public money, and statues of himself erected in public spaces across the empire's vast territories. But it was his religious claims that most profoundly disturbed Conte. Temporary observers. Caligula insisted on being worshipped not merely as emperor but as a living god, demanding temples consecrated to his divine person, and priests appointed specifically to conduct sacrifices in his name. In Alexandria, where the ancient traditions of Egyptian religion had always blurred the boundary between mortal rulers and divine beings, he declared himself the new pharaoh, binding Roman authority to the tradition of the god-kings who had ruled the Nile Valley for 3,000 years. In Rome itself, he reportedly appeared in public, dressed as various deities, as Jupiter the sky god, as Mars the god of war, as Apollo the god of light and reason, as Neptune the ruler of the sea, presenting himself to the public as the living embodiment of divine power on earth. He had the heads removed from statues of various Greek and Roman gods and replaced with likenesses of his own face. Most provocatively, he attempted to have a colossal statue of himself, dressed as Jupiter, that is, erected within the Temple of Jerusalem, the most sacred space in Judaism, the physical dwelling place of the God of Israel, whose religious law absolutely prohibited any graven images, let alone images of a pagan emperor claiming divine status. The order, carried out through the Syrian governor Publius Petronius, came within a dangerous distance of execution, before Caligula's death in 41 CE removed the threat. The episode produced a crisis of terrifying intensity in Judea that foreshadowed the far more catastrophic Jewish revolt that would come a generation later under Nero and Vespasian. The cruelty that emerged alongside the megalomania was equally alarming in its arbitrariness and in its evident enjoyment of inflicting pain and terror on those around him. Caligula's temper was volcanic and unpredictable in ways that made every encounter with him a potential death sentence. At formal banquets, attended by the highest figures of Roman society, senators, generals, members of the equestria, in order he would engage in displays of casual cruelty that were the more frightening for their apparent casualness. Ancient accounts describe him laughing without warning at the sight of a consul's obvious discomfort, then explaining pleasantly that he had just reflected that he could have them all killed with a single word. He invited distinguished guests to dine, then had them arrested and their property confiscated to fund his escalating expenditures. His treatment of the Roman Senate, the ancient institution that had governed Rome for 5 centuries before the Car, and that still retained enormous symbolic authority, was a sustained exercise in contemptuous humiliation. He summoned senators to meetings in the middle of the night for no purpose. He compelled them to run beside his litter for long distances. He made them wait barefoot for hours in the Roman sun while he dined at leisure inside. He reportedly appointed his favorite horse in Citatus, a well-fed animal, who was said to have had a stable of marble and a manger of ivory to various positions of honor, and according to some sources was planning to make him a consul. Whether the plan was literal or simply an act of deliberate, theatrical contempt for the institution of the consulship, a way of saying that his horse was worth more to him than any senator the message communicated, was the same. Absolute power had made him indifferent to every constraint of Roman tradition and law. He persecuted those closest to him with the same ruthlessness he directed outward. His cousin Gemellus, whom he had initially named as joint heir, was executed on suspicion that his survival posed a threat. His grandmother Antonia Minor, daughter of Mark Antony, and Octavia, a woman of immense dignity and influence, who had reportedly rebuked his behavior directly, reportedly died by his order. His 3 sisters Agrippina, the younger, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla, experienced the full range of his manic favoritism and subsequent suspicion. Drusilla, his apparent favorite, died in 38 CE, and Caligula had her deified the first living Roman woman ever to receive divine honors and compelled the whole empire to mourn her, as though a goddess had been taken from the earth. His other sisters were later accused of various treasons and exiled to the barren Pontian Islands. The military campaigns that Caligula directed beyond Rome's borders added absurdity to cruelty, in combinations that would be darkly comic if the consequences for those involved had not been so serious. In 39 CE, he assembled a massive military force in Gaul, marching his legions to the northern coast, near the Rhine, ostensibly preparing for 2 simultaneous operations, a punitive campaign across the Rhine into Germany and an invasion of Britain across the Channel. Both operations were anticipated with some genuine strategic logic, since both represented unfinished business from the campaigns of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Instead, what followed was a theater of the bizarre. The German campaign consisted of crossing the Rhine and immediately returning, with a few prisoners collected from the existing Roman garrison for a staged capture. For the British invasion, the army was marched to the Channel coast, where, instead of boarding ships, the soldiers were ordered by the emperor to collect seashells from the beach, declaring them the spoils of ocean and trophies of victory over Neptune, god of the sea. The soldiers, trained for combat and desperate for the military glory that emperors were expected to provide and legionaries depended on for donatives and advancement, found themselves carrying baskets of seashells back toward Rome, as though they were golden treasures. By 41 CE, the Senate, the aristocracy, and most critically, the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit of approximately 9,000 soldiers whose primary function was protecting the emperor's person, had all reached their limits. The Guard's officers, who had endured years of insults, humiliations, and genuine fear for their lives, finally acted. The conspiracy was led by Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard whom Caligula had made a particular object of public mockery. On January 24, 41 CE, as Caligula was making his way through a covered passage of the Palatine Palace complex, a group of officers surrounded him in the corridor. Multiple wounds were inflicted. The emperor, who had insisted on his own divinity, died like any mortal man in pain, in blood, in a narrow corridor, at the hands of the soldiers who were supposed to die for him. His wife Caesonia and their infant daughter Julia Drusilla were killed on the same day, to prevent any future claims in his name. His reign had lasted 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days. The Senate immediately gathered to debate abolishing the imperial system entirely and restoring the republic. So profound was the disgust the preceding 4 years had generated. They were quickly persuaded to. Quanti hat the empire's size made such a restoration impractical, and more immediately, that the Praetorian Guard had already found and proclaimed Caligula's uncle Claudius as the next emperor, making the question academic. He became a warning etched into the deepest foundations of Roman political memory, a reminder that absolute power, unchecked by any institutional restraint, any personal character, or any genuine concern for the people it claimed to serve, could unravel even the greatest empire. And so, as Rome returned to its daily life, the clatter of carts on the Via Sacra, the murmur of voices in the Forum, the prayers offered to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, the story of Caligula became both nightmare and lesson for every ruler who came after. Drop your current city and local time in the comments below. We love knowing where in the world our listeners are joining us from tonight. The year was 54 CE, and Rome stood once again at a crossroads between promise and catastrophe. Conti, Roth, Claudius the scholarly, unexpectedly capable emperor who had restored institutional stability after Caligula's lunacy, overseen the successful invasion of Britain in 43 CE, and governed with a competence that his peculiar personal mannerisms and physical disabilities had made easy for contemporaries to underestimate, had breathed his last, almost certainly by poison, administered by his wife Agrippina, the younger, at a dinner that included, according to Tacitus, a dish of mushrooms, the same dish that the Romans would subsequently euphemistically refer to as the food of the gods, since it was the vehicle by which one man became a god and another was poisoned. Into the corridors of absolute power stepped Claudius's 16-year-old stepson, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, born to Agrippina, and her first husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, adopted by Claudius at Agrippina's insistence and renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. He was not yet 17. A boy, suddenly closed, clad in imperial purple, crowned with a responsibility that would have tested the wisdom of men 3 times his age, presented to the armies and the people as the embodiment of imperial continuity. Rome watched with cautious hope that was neither fully credulous nor entirely cynical. He was young, certainly, but Augustus himself had been very young when he began accumulating power after Julius Caesar's assassination. Some saw in him the freshness of youth, the possibility of a clean beginning after the relative dullness of Claudius's administration. Others whispered of the dangers of inexperience, of a mind too easily shaped by the powerful figures who surrounded it, particularly his mother Agrippina, who had engineered his succession with calculating precision and who clearly intended to continue governing through her son, with the same ruthless efficiency she had applied to securing the throne for him. At first, the promise seemed genuine and substantial. Nero's earliest years as emperor, Compur, were guided by 2 of the most capable figures available in the Roman world. His tutor, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher from Corduba in Spain, whose prose writings on ethics, fate, and the proper conduct of the powerful remain among the finest in Latin literature, counseled moderation, justice, and the proper relationship between a ruler and his subjects. Sextus Afranius Burrus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, steered the young emperor toward prudence and institutional stability. Under their combined influence, the first 5 years of Nero's reign, what the period Seneca himself described as the quinquennium Neronis. The 5 good years were characterized by genuine administrative competence. Taxes were rationalized. The Senate was treated with conspicuous respect. Prosecutions for treason were dramatically reduced. Public games were generous. The empire, broadly speaking, thrived. Citizens who watched Nero's chariot proceed through the streets of Rome in those early years allowed themselves to believe that the imperial system might have found, in this young man, the philosopher king that Plato had dreamed of, and Rome had never quite produced. The whispers of concern about his relationship with his mother, about his artistic pretensions, about a certain volatility in his temperament that occasionally flashed through the careful presentation of the ideal persona, as the inevitable anxieties of people who had been trained by experience to be suspicious of good fortune. The darker reality beneath the surface was Agrippina's absolute determination to share, and if possible to control, imperial power. She had spent years maneuvering her son onto the throne through a combination of strategic marriages, well-placed poisonings, and relentless political pressure. She had no intention of surrendering that investment, now that the goal had been achieved. She appeared on official coins with her son, an unprecedented honor for an empress. She sat beside him when he received foreign ambassadors, visibly sharing the audience that imperial protocol normally reserved for the emperor alone. When a delegation of Armenians arrived to discuss their kingdom's political allegiance, Agrippina attempted to ascend to the dais and sit beside Nero in a position of co-rulership, and was only redirected by Seneca's quick thinking in prompting Nero to descend and greet his mother instead, transforming the moment from political catastrophe into a display of filial affection. For a young emperor whose pride was as fragile as it was intense, the experience of being perpetually overshadowed by his mother was psychologically suffocating. In the first years, he managed the resentment with varying degrees of success. But by 59 CE, after a series of escalating confrontations over his choice of mistress, the freed slave Claudia Acti, whom Agrippina despised and threatened to have removed, over his growing independence from her political guidance, and his refusal to be managed, the young emperor decided that Agrippina must die. The methods he attempted before succeeding revealed both the spectacular theatrical imagination that characterized his personality and his fundamental unseriousness about practical execution. The most famous, the collapsible boat, involved a vessel specifically designed with a hidden mechanism that would cause it to flood and sink when the mechanism was triggered, drowning Agrippina as she sailed across the Bay of Baiae on a pleasant evening excursion. The plan failed when Agrippina survived the sinking, swimming to shore and sending a freedman to her son with the message that she had fortunately escaped a terrible accident. The sarcasm, if any was intended, was presumably lost on Nero, who responded by dispatching a squad of naval officers to her seaside villa with instructions to finish the task. When they arrived, Agrippina, reportedly understanding what was happening, bared her abdomen and commanded to strike at the womb that had produced such a son. They complied. With his mother dead, whatever remained of the institutional constraints that Seneca and Burrus had maintained around him dissolved progressively. Burrus died in 62 CE, probably of throat cancer, though Nero's enemies claimed poison. Seneca, reading the political weather correctly, retired from public life with Nero's permission and returned to philosophical writing. The emperor's new principal advisors were figures of very different character, most notably Gaius Ophonius Tigellinus, the new Praetorian prefect, a man whose advice tended toward the elimination of enemies rather than the cultivation of stability. Freed from constraint, Nero indulged the artistic ambitions that had always been his most genuine passion, and that, Roman social convention had always required him to conduct discreetly. He fancied himself a serious artist, singer, and lyre player of genuine accomplishment, a poet whose compositions deserved a real audience rather than merely polite applause, a charioteer capable of genuine competition in the hippodrome. The problem was not that his artistic interests were inherently disreputable, though Roman aristocratic culture did regard professional performance as socially demeaning for men of standing. The problem was his insistence on performing publicly before massive audiences who were not offered the option of polite non-attendance, and demanding not merely applause but rapturous, sustained, unconditional adoration that bore no relationship to the actual quality of what he was performing. He established his own musical and theatrical competitions, the Neronia, held in 60 CE and 65 CE, in which he entered and, with the inevitability that accompanies absolute power, won first prize. He toured Greece beginning in 66 CE, competing in the great Panhellenic festivals at Olympia, Delphi, Corinth, and Nemea, events that had for centuries been restricted to Greek citizens. He competed in chariot racing, musical contests, and theatrical performance, winning every event he entered through a combination of genuine practice, imperial intimidation, and the judge's entirely rational desire not to place second before the man who controlled the fate of the Roman world. He reportedly won 1,808 first-place crowns during the Greek tour. He was so appreciative of the Greeks' cultural sensitivity in recognizing his artistic genius that he declared Greece the entire province liberated from taxation, a gesture of imperial generosity that his successors eventually reversed, but that demonstrated the characteristic Neronian pattern of spectacular, expensive, short-lived magnificence. Then came the Great Fire of Rome. On the night of July 18, 64 CE, a sweltering Roman summer, the Tiber sluggish and low, the city's narrow streets packed with wooden tenement buildings, and the dried goods of shop fronts fire broke out in the warehouses and market stalls along the southeastern end of the Cos Maximus. The fire had access to materials perfectly designed to feed it, and winds perfectly designed to spread it, and for 6 days it raged through Rome's oldest and densest neighborhoods, devouring temples, markets, workshops, and the crowded tenements of the urban poor. Of Rome's 14 administrative districts, 10 were damaged or destroyed. 3 were burned completely to the ground. The most sacred spaces in the city, including areas that had stood since the city's founding centuries earlier, were reduced to ash. Nero was at his villa in Antium, modern Anzio, when the fire broke out and returned to Rome to organize relief efforts, opening his personal gardens and public buildings for the homeless, arranging food supplies, and supervising firefighting operations. Yet the ancient sources, writing with the hostile perspective of those who had survived his reign and had every reason to blacken his memory, attached to his name the image that has endured across 2 millennia. Pompei. That while Rome burned, Nero mounted a stage, dressed in theatrical costume, and performed his own composition about the fall of Troy, treating the destruction of Rome as the atmospheric backdrop for his own artistic self-expression. Whether the fiddling while Rome burned story, which is, in any case, anachronistic since the violin was not invented until the 16th century, has any historical foundation, is genuinely contested by scholars. Tacitus, writing about 40 years after the fire, notes the story but marks it as uncertain. What is certain is that Nero seized upon the fire's destruction as an extraordinary opportunity for urban redevelopment. On the vast cleared areas of the burned city, he began construction of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace complex of staggering ambition and scale that made every previous imperial building project look modest. The Domus Aurea eventually occupied approximately 125 acres of central Rome, an area that had previously been if the most densely inhabited urban real estate in the world. Its main banqueting hall had a rotating ceiling, designed to revolve like the heavens above dining guests. Its rooms were decorated with gold leaf, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Its gardens included a man-made lake. At its entrance stood a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, approximately 30 meters in height, modeled on the Colossus of Rhodes that had been one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The project required the forcible displacement of thousands of Roman citizens from land their families had occupied for generations, the expenditure of money that the treasury did not have, and the physical demonstration to every Roman that their emperor valued his own comfort and grandeur above the welfare of the city's ordinary inhabitants. It was at this point, if not before, that Nero's popular support, never as solid as the early enthusiasm had suggested, began to genuinely and permanently erode. The scapegoat count for the fire in the small community of Christians living in Rome represented another turning point in his relationship with both his subjects and with history. The Christians, adherents of a new Jewish sect that worshipped a Galilean teacher executed by Pontius Pilate approximately 30 years earlier, were a sufficiently small, sufficiently obscure, and sufficiently socially marginal group to make ideal victims of official violence. Their refusal to participate in the civic religious observances through which Romans expressed community loyalty, their secretive meeting practices, and their theological convictions, including, notoriously, their belief that the world as they knew it was ending soon, made them easy targets for the accusation of misanthropy and antisocial behavior that Nero required. The persecutions that followed established precedents and produced martyrs, including, according to early Christian tradition, both the Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul, whose story, comme ours, became foundational to the identity of a religion that would within 3 centuries transform the Roman Empire itself. The years between 64 and 68 CE were characterized by an accelerating cycle of paranoia, execution, and institutional destruction that consumed much of what remained of Rome's senatorial and intellectual leadership. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE, a genuine plot involving a large number of senators, equestrians, military officers, and even the poet Lucan, was discovered and punished with a thoroughness that eliminated many of the most capable and admired figures in Roman public life. Seneca himself was ordered to commit suicide, which he did with the stoic composure he had spent a lifetime theorizing about. General Domitius Corbulo, arguably the most militarily capable Roman commander of the era, whose campaigns in Armenia had restored Roman prestige in the East, was summoned to Greece and ordered to kill himself, on no specific charge, apparently simply because high military reputation made him potentially dangerous. Gaius Petronius, the author of the Satyricon, and one of the most sophisticated literary minds of the century, was similarly disposed of. The revolts that swept the empire's periphery in 66 and 67 CE, the Great Jewish Revolt in Judea, beginning with the massacre of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, and serious military unrest in Britain, and the Rhineland received inadequate attention from an emperor who was touring Greek theatres. By 68 CE, the patience of the provinces had exhausted itself. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, raised a rebellion, calling for Nero's replacement. When Vindex was defeated militarily, but the spirit of his rebellion spread to Spain under Servius Sulpicius Galba, and then to other provincial commanders, and finally even to the Praetorian Guard, the institutional foundation of Nero's power dissolved within days. The emperor, who had imagined himself an artist of world historical significance, fled the city with a handful of attendants, made his way to a suburban villa belonging to a freedman named Phaon, and spent his final hours unable to gather the resolution to end his own life. He was finally assisted by his secretary, Epaphroditus, the same man who years later would be executed by Domitian for this act, a final irony of Neronian fate and died with words that have echoed across the centuries as perhaps the most perfectly self-revealing final statement in the annals of historical egotism. Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. He was 30 years old. The Senate declared him a public enemy hostis publicus, and ordered the erasure of his name from inscriptions and public monuments through the practice of damnatio memoria, condemnation of memory. Yet memory has its own logic, and Nero's image, whether in hatred or in the peculiar fascination that extreme character always generates, refused to be erased. In the eastern provinces of the empire, stories circulate. Lated for decades that he was still alive, that he would return, that the artist emperor was merely hiding, waiting for his moment. 3 separate impostors appeared in the decades after his death, claiming to be the returned Nero. The shadow he cast stretched long beyond the grave, as theatrical in death as he had been in life. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Comment your city and local time below. We read every single one. The year was 1199, and the throne of England passed into the most uneasy of hands. Richard I, Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, had died as he had lived, in characteristic dramatic fashion, from a crossbow bolt lodged in his shoulder that had become infected while he was conducting a siege of the minor Château de Chalais-Chabrol in Limousin. It was an inglorious end for a king whose entire public identity was built around the glamour of martial prowess. His younger brother John, long overshadowed, long suspected, long associated with failed project, T.S. and abandoned allies, now ascended to the crown of England, the Duchy of Normandy, and the vast Angevin territories stretching across western France. To many observers, the accession seemed almost a cosmic accident. John had been nicknamed Lackland by his own father Henry II, precisely because, as the youngest of Henry's legitimate sons, no specific territorial inheritance had been reserved for him. His older brothers Henry, the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and their various allocations had consumed the available inheritances before John's position in the succession was reached. That he had survived to inherit everything was the result of deaths, rebellions, and the particular brutality of Plantagenet family dynamics that had consumed each of his brothers before they could consolidate their own positions. England in 1199 was a kingdom that had been taxed heavily to finance the Third Crusade, strained by the enormous ransom that had been required to free Richard from his Austrian captivity, and somewhat exhausted by the glamorous but expensive foreign adventures of a king who had spent almost none of his 10-year reign, actually, in England. The administration was capable. Richard's absentee rule had required capable administrators, and England possessed them. But the kingdom needed a king who could govern, rather than simply glamorize, who could manage the complex balance of royal, baronial, and ecclesiastical interests that English medieval governance required. John was, in many respects, not intellectually incapable of that task. Unlike many medieval kings, he was genuinely literate and intellectually engaged. He owned a surprisingly large library for his era, and actually read the books in it. He had a detailed, practical memory for financial and administrative matters that could make him a formidable presence in day-to-day government when he chose to apply himself. He spoke multiple languages fluently. He understood law and could deploy legal argument with sophistication. These were genuine assets that a more stable character might have turned into effective governance. But beneath these intellectual gifts lay a personality of deep and ultimately self-destructive flaws, a pervasive suspicion that prevented him from trusting the allies, without whose loyalty no medieval king could function, a temper that moved from cold calculation to volcanic fury without predictable warning, a cruelty that went beyond the operational ruthlessness that medieval governance often required into something that appeared to be genuine enjoyment of others' suffering, and an insecurity that translated the normal challenges of kingship into personal affronts requiring punishment. His problems began immediately. Across the Channel, in the rich territories of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Aquitaine, that the Angevin kings had assembled through a combination of inheritance, strategic marriage, and military force over the preceding century. The barons questioned the legitimacy, cruelty of his title. His nephew Arthur of Brittany, the 12-year-old son of John's older brother, Geoffrey, whose prior claim to the Angevin inheritance under strict primogeniture was arguably stronger than John's, had his own supporters, particularly in France, where King Philip II Augustus saw in the dispute precisely the opportunity he had been waiting for to dismantle the vast Angevin continental empire that had made English kings more powerful French landholders than the French king himself. In 1200, John purchased a temporary peace with Philip through territorial concessions and arranged a marriage to Isabella of Angoulême, a young noblewoman of strategic importance whose betrothal to Hugh IX of Lusignan, a powerful baron of Poitou, John simply ignored. The Lusignan family appealed to Philip as their overlord. Philip convened a feudal court that summoned John to appear and answer for his conduct. John refused, claiming that as a peer of France, he could not be judged by a French company. Philip's court declared his French lands forfeit. The worst moment of the early struggle came with Arthur of Brittany. In 1202, Arthur's forces were defeated, and Arthur himself fell into John's hands near Maillebois, in Anjou. Contemporary chronicles record what happened next, with varying degrees of certainty and horror. Some sources suggest that John personally murdered his 16-year-old nephew in a drunken rage at Rouen, throwing the body into the Seine. Others describe simply that Arthur disappeared into John's custody and was never seen or heard from again, which, given the efficiency with which political prisoners could be made to disappear in medieval dungeons, amounted to the same thing in practical terms. Whatever the precise truth, Arthur's disappearance destroyed John's reputation among the Breton and Norman nobility, who now had every reason to fear that their lives were forfeit if they fell into his power. The defections began. By 1204, Normandy, the heartland of Angers, power in France, the territory from which the Norman kings had launched their conquest of England in 1066, the land whose loss would have seemed unthinkable to any of John's predecessors, was lost to Philip Augustus. The English king, who had inherited more French land than any previous English ruler, had managed to lose it all within 5 years. The financial requirements of attempting to recover these losses through diplomatic pressure, through alliance building, through the military campaigns that culminated in the catastrophe of Bouvines in 1214 imposed crushing burdens on the Kingdom of England. John taxed, with an inventiveness and a thoroughness that his predecessors had not matched, but that his subjects experienced as extortion. Scutage, the payment made by barons who preferred to pay money rather than perform their feudal military service, was levied at rates and frequencies that exceeded any previous standard. Arbitrary fines were imposed for real and invented offences. Fines for inheriting lands were set at whatever level the royal administration thought it could extract. The sale of justice, the practice of charging fees for favourable legal outcomes, was systematic and open. The hostage-taking of barons' family members as security for their financial obligations and military service was routine. The brutal fate of Matilda de Breos and her son William became perhaps the most notorious single episode of John's domestic cruelty. Her husband William de Breos had been one of John's closest supporters, but had fallen from favour and fled to France. When John demanded repayment of enormous debts, Matilda, with the kind of directness that proved politically fatal, reportedly told the royal messenger that she would not deliver her sons as hostages to a king who had murdered his own nephew. John's response was to hunt the family across England, Ireland, and Scotland with obsessive determination. Matilda and her son William the Younger were eventually Captain Conte, imprisoned in Windsor Castle and left to starve to death. Their bodies were reportedly found with the mother having partially eaten her son's cheeks in the extremity of hunger before dying herself. The story, whatever its precise factual accuracy, circulated throughout England and created an image of the king as a man capable of the most primitive cruelty. The quarrel with the Church that consumed the years 1208 to 1213 added a theological dimension to John's difficulties. The specific dispute concerned the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest ecclesiastical office in England. John rejected Pope Innocent III's candidate. The Pope responded with the Interdict of 1208, which suspended church services throughout England for 6 years. No masses said, no baptisms performed with full rites, no Christian burials conducted. The people of England, for whom the sacraments were not merely religious formalities, but the essential framework of their entire spiritual existence, experienced the interdict as a profound personal catastrophe. John's excommunication in 1209, his formal exclusion from the community of Christendom, provided his barons with an argument that they were no longer bound to obey him. By 1213, with the combined threats of French invasion, papal pressure, and domestic rebellion pressing from every direction simultaneously, John submitted completely. He surrendered England as a papal fief, acknowledging Innocent III as his overlord and agreeing to pay an annual tribute to Rome. For a man who had spent 4 years defying the most powerful ecclesiastical authority in the world, the capitulation was total and humiliating. The disaster of Bouvines on July 27, 1214, in which Philip Augustus's French forces decisively defeated John's continental allies under his nephew Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, ending any realistic prospect of recovering the lost French territories, was the final military straw. John returned to England empty-handed, deeply in debt, having demonstrated that the enormous financial extractions of his reign had produced no military results worth having. His barons had had enough. By the spring of 1215, a substantial coalition of barons, initially centered on the northern lords, who had suffered most consistently from John's financial predations, was in open rebellion and had occupied London. John, cornered and unable to fight, agreed to negotiate. The meeting took place in June 1215 at Runnymede, a meadow on the south bank of the Thames between Windsor and Staines Ground, that would become one of the most historically significant pieces of real estate in the world. The document they produced, Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was in its original conception a feudal peace treaty more than a constitutional manifesto. Its 63 clauses addressed the specific practical grievances of the barons: limits on scutage and taxation without consent, restoration of lands seized arbitra, compie, Riley, prohibition of selling or denying justice, the famous clause 39 guaranteeing that no free man would be imprisoned or deprived of his lands, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. Its intended beneficiaries were primarily the nobility rather than the common people of England. Its legal philosophy was essentially conservative, a restatement and codification of customary rights that the barons claimed John had violated, rather than a revolutionary innovation. But Magna Carta became something vastly larger than its immediate political function, because it established for the first time in English legal history the principle that the king himself was subject to law, that royal power was not unlimited, that there were things a king could not do to free subjects without legal process. That consent, the consent of the Great Council, the precursor of Parliament, was required for extraordinary taxation. These principles, applied and extended across subsequent conti, went centuries by lawyers, parliamentarians, and revolutionaries who cited Magna Carta as their authority, became the foundation not merely of English constitutional law, but of every democratic constitution that drew on the English tradition. The irony is almost too perfect. The worst King England ever had, the king remembered by medieval chroniclers as treacherous, cowardly, tyrannical, faithless, and cruel produced, through the catastrophic accumulation of his failures, one of the most important constitutional documents in the history of human freedom. Magna Carta was his most enduring legacy, and he never intended it. He sealed it only because he had no alternative, appealed to Rome to have it annulled within weeks of sealing it, and died in 1216, in the middle of the civil war that followed, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry III to inherit a kingdom in chaos. His loss of the crown jewels in the Wash, the estuary of the Great Ouse in Lincolnshire, where his baggage train crossed Canterbury 1216, and was caught by the tidal surge, losing an unknown quantity of royal treasure, including, possibly, jewels, regalia, and financial reserves accumulated over decades, is somehow perfectly characteristic. John's reign literally vanished into the tide. What country are you tuning in from tonight? Leave a comment below with your location and local time. Let us know you are here. The year was 1380, and France lay exhausted under the weight of 43 years of intermittent war with England. And as the 100 Years' War, that extraordinary prolonged contest over French territory and the legitimacy of the French crown that had begun in 1337, under Edward III's claim to the French throne through his Capetian mother, Isabella had already consumed an entire generation of French manpower, wealth, and institutional confidence. The Black Death had swept through France in 1347 to 1352, killing perhaps a third of the population. The English longbowmen at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers 1356 had demonstrated that the heavily armored French chivalric tradition was catastrophically vulnerable to disciplined English archery. The capture of King John II at Poitiers and the enormous ransom required for his release had strained French finances. The Jacquerie peasant uprising of 1358 had demonstrated the depth of social anger beneath the glittering surface of aristocratic France. King Charles V, wisely called the Wise by a posterity that recognized in him the combination of political intelligence and administrative competence that had stabilized France after its worst disasters, had spent his reign from 1364 to 1380 patiently rebuilding. He had reformed royal finances, reconstituted the army under the brilliant and innovative Bertrand du Guesclin, recovered most of the English-held territories through attrition rather than pitched battle, and created the conditions for genuine recovery. He died in September 1380, leaving behind a realm fragile but coherent, and a son barely 11 years old. That son, Charles VI, stepped onto the throne of France as a boy king, his reign beginning not with triumph, but with the weight of the impossible expectations that his father's achievements had created. Power during his minority rested in the hands of regents, specifically his 4 royal uncles, the Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon, each of whom combined genuine political capability with personal greed of a scale that made the previous generation's financial problems look modest. They taxed, they appropriated, they appointed their own clients to offices that Charles V had filled with competent professionals. The revenues that Charles V had carefully husbanded flowed into ducal treasuries rather than the royal one. Popular resentment accumulated rapidly. In 1381, the same year as the Great Peasants' Revolt in England, serious tax rebellions erupted in Paris, Rouen, and other French cities under the name of the Maletins rioters, armed with the leaden mallets of the city's workers. When Charles came of age and assumed personal rule in 1388, at the age of 20, the kingdom's reaction was one of genuine relief. He dismissed his uncles, recalled his father's trusted advisors, the marmosets, the little images, a mocking nickname that became a term of genuine affection, and began governing with a diligence and intelligence that seemed to homage the continuation of his father's careful work. He was handsome, energetic, personally accessible, and apparently committed to the serious business of rule. The Parisians called him Charles le Bien-Aimé, Charles the Beloved, and for a few years the name seemed earned. Then came August 1392, and the event that would define everything that followed. Charles had set out on a military expedition into Brittany, determined to punish Pierre de Craon for a murderous assault on the king's favorite, Olivier de Clisson. The army was traveling through the forest of Le Mans on a hot summer afternoon when a barefoot man in rough clothing suddenly emerged from the trees and seized the bridle of the king's horse, crying that the king was betrayed and should ride no further. The man was beaten away. The procession continued. Then, as the army emerged from the forest into the open plain, a page accidentally dropped a lance against a shield with a sharp, metallic clang. The sound, unexpected and piercing in the still afternoon air, was the trigger. Charles drew his sword. He wheeled his horse. His eyes, witnesses would later recall with horror, had taken on an expression that none of them had seen before. He screamed that he was surrounded by traitors. He began striking at the men around him, his own knights, his own household troops, his own companions. He killed 4 men before he could be overpowered and restrained. When the frenzy passed, he collapsed into exhaustion and confusion, apparently unaware of what had occurred. He was 34 years old. He would live for 30 more years, and his mind would never fully return. The episodes of madness that consumed the remainder of his reign varied in character and severity, in ways that modern psychiatrists, reading the surviving medieval accounts, have variously diagnosed as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic episodes, or some form of encephalitis-triggered mental illness. What the medical taxonomy was matters less than the functional reality. Charles experienced recurring episodes of severe psychotic crisis, lasting weeks or months at a time, during which he was incapable of governing, incapable sometimes of recognizing his own family, and occasionally physically dangerous to those around him. During one prolonged episode, he refused to bathe or change clothes for months, developing sores on his body from neglect. During another, he became convinced that he was made of glass, that his body was literally fabricated from spun glass, so fragile that a careless touch might shatter him, and ordered iron rods sewn into the lining of his clothing to prevent him from breaking. He would not allow his wife, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, to approach him during these periods, failing to recognize her and describing her as a strange woman who was trying to harm him. He ran through the corridors of the royal palaces, pursuing imaginary enemies or fleeing imaginary threats. He sat for hours in complete silence, immobile, unreachable, with the fixed emptiness of someone whose consciousness had temporarily evacuated its bodily residence. The court managed these episodes as best it could, calling on physicians whose understanding of mental illness was limited to bloodletting, herbal preparations, and prayer, bringing entertainers to the king in hopes of stimulating his attention and restoring some fragment of his reason, and simply waiting. During Charles's lucid intervals, which could last weeks or even months, he was genuinely capable of intelligent engagement with governance, and some administrative decisions from the period of his reign bear the marks of coherent thought. But the lucid periods became shorter, and the episodes of madness more frequent and more severe as the years passed. Into the vacuum of royal authority stepped the factions that the structure of French aristocratic politics was always prone to producing. The 2 principal competitors were Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, Charles's uncle, the most powerful of the regents who had exploited the previous minority, and Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's own brother. Philip died in 1404, and his son John the Fearless, Jean Sans-Pour, inherited Burgundy's ambitions along with its territories. Louis of Orleans was charming, extravagant, and reportedly intimate with Queen Isabeau in ways that generated gossip and deeply complicated the political situation. Between these 2 powerful figures, and their respective networks of clientage and alliance, France fractured into competing factions, whose rivalry consumed the kingdom's resources and attention, while England watched with calculating patience. The assassination of Louis of Orleans, on the night of November 23, 1407, hacked to death in a Paris street by a group of hired killers as he returned from visiting the Queen. On the orders of John the Fearless was the event that transformed competition into civil war. John's subsequent defense of the killing, through the philosopher Jean Baptiste's scandalous justification of tyrannicide, ensured that no reconciliation was possible. France divided into Burgundians, supporters of the Duke of Burgundy, and Armagnacs, partisans of the Orleans heir, named after Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, who effectively led the faction. Both sides claimed to act in the name and interest of the incapacitated king, whose periodic signatures and seals were deployed by whichever faction happened to be in control of his person at any given moment. The people of France, the ordinary inhabitants of Paris, Rouen, Lyon, Bordeaux, and the thousands of smaller towns and villages, paid the price for this noble civil war in blood, taxation, and the daily terror of armed bands, answering to one faction or another, moving through the countryside. The roads became dangerous. Markets were disrupted. The peasantry, already bearing the accumulated burden of decades of war and disease, found their remaining resources consumed by the company, eating demands of rival dukes. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Henry, the young English king, who combined genuine military genius with the calculating patience of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, watched French civil war with the focused attention of a chess player observing his opponent's position deteriorate. In August 1415, he landed in France with an army of approximately 11,000 men. By October, after the capture of Harfleur had reduced his force to perhaps 6,000, exhausted and disease-weakened, he was moving through Normandy toward Calais when the French army cut him off near the village of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt, on October 25, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, was one of the most catastrophic defeats in French military history. The French army, perhaps 12,000 to 36,000 strong, depending on the source consulted, engaged on a rain-soaked field between two woods, in a formation that maximized the disadvantages of heavy armor in deep mud while minimizing the tactica, the advantages that should have belonged to a much larger force. The English longbowmen, arguably the most lethal infantry weapon system of the medieval world, at ranges of up to 200 meters, capable of losing 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute and penetrating or displacing plate armor at close range, cut down the advancing French men-at-arms in numbers that contemporaries found difficult to credit. French casualties numbered in the thousands. English casualties were in the hundreds. The cream of French noble military leadership, dukes, counts, barons, marshals, lay dead on the field or were taken prisoner. Charles VI, in the grip of one of his episodes, had not been present at Agincourt. He had been incapable of leading his army, or even of comprehending the disaster in its immediate aftermath. The final humiliation of his reign came with the Treaty of Troyes in May 1420. The treaty, negotiated between Henry V and the Burgundian faction, with Queen Isabeau's active support, disinherit the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, on the grounds of doubts about his parentage, declared Henry V of England as Charles VI's heir and regent, and arranged the marriage of Henry to Catherine of Valois, Charles's daughter. France, the kingdom that had existed as a continuous political entity for 5 centuries, was being signed away by a mad king and a compromised queen into the hands of an English conqueror. Charles VI died in October 1422, aged 53, having been on the throne for 42 years, the last decade of which had seen his kingdom occupied in the north by English forces, torn apart by civil war, and stripped of what remained of its institutional dignity. Henry V had died unexpectedly 2 months earlier, leaving an infant king, Henry VI of England, as the nominal ruler of both England and France, with England's most capable regent, the Duke of Bedford, managing France on his behalf. The France that eventually recovered from the catastrophe of Charles VI's reign. Did so through the agency of forces that were among the most improbable in the history of European warfare. A teenage peasant girl from Domremy named Jeanne d'Arc, who heard voices that she identified as divine instruction, who rallied the remaining French forces under the Dauphin's banner, and who, in less than a year, transformed the military situation from apparent English triumph to French revival. But that story belongs to the generation after Charles VI's death, not to his reign. His story is a tragedy in the most classical sense, a person of genuine early promise, whose life was shattered by an illness that no one around him understood, and that no medical intervention available in 15th century France could have treated, whose personal suffering was real and documented, and whose incapacity became a national catastrophe of the first magnitude. He deserves pity. The people who suffered under the consequences of his incapacity deserved better. The year was 1530. In the Red, Rick fortress complex of Kolomenskoye, on the high bank of the Moscow River south of the city, a child was born who would grow up to transform Russia from a collection of struggling principalities into a centralized empire, and who would, in the process, establish the template of unlimited autocratic power and systematic state terror that would shape Russian governance for the next 5 centuries. His name was Ivan Vasilievich. He was the son of Vasily III, Grand Prince of Muscovy, and his second wife Elena Glinskaya, whose family had Tatar and Lithuanian connections that would later feed conspiracist suspicion about the boy's loyalties and character. His birth was accompanied by the standard celebrations, bells rung, prayers said, the court gathering to pay respects to the heir, whose existence secured the Rurikid dynasty's future. No one in that court could have imagined what future they were celebrating. He was 3 years old when his father died in December 1533. His mother became regent, and for the 5 years of her regency governed with a combination of competence and political ruthlessness that managed to hold the state together against the competing claims of the boyar families, the ancient hereditary nobility of Russian society, who circled the throne of a child prince like wolves around an injured deer. In April 1538, Elena died suddenly, suspiciously, almost certainly poisoned by the Shuisky family, the most powerful of the boyar clans, who immediately seized de facto control of the regency. What followed were 8 years of Ivan's childhood under the governance of successive boyar factions who competed for control of the state with a ruthlessness that made no allowance for the presence of a child prince in the middle of their struggles. Ivan's own later account of this period, written in his extraordinary letters to the defected boyar Prince Andrei Kurbsky, the most remarkable epistolary debate between a ruler and a political exile in the history of poetry. Political theory describes conditions of deliberate neglect and active humiliation. He and his brother Yuri were left inadequately clothed and fed, ignored by servants who directed their attentions toward whichever faction currently held power, subjected to the sight of violent confrontations between rival boyar groups that sometimes extended even into his presence chamber. What Ivan did have was the extensive library that had accumulated in the Moscow palace, the books brought from Byzantium and from Western Europe, the chronicles of Russian history, the theological texts of the Orthodox Church, and a mind sharp enough and hungry enough to read them with genuine absorption. From the chronicles, he built a historical sense of Muscovite destiny and Russian identity. From the theological texts, he constructed a theory of divine authority that placed the ruler not merely at the head of a political hierarchy, but as God's chosen instrument on earth, answerable only to God for the exercise of his power. From observation of the boyars around him, he learned with the particular intensity of a child who has no adult protector and must understand the world without guidance, how men wielded cruelty and deception, how power operated through fear rather than affection, and how those who appeared most powerful were most dangerous. On January 16, 1547, in the Cathedral of the Dormition, within the Moscow Kremlin, the 17-year-old Ivan Vasilievich was crowned not merely as Grand Prince of Muscovy, the title his predecessors had used, but as Tsar of all Rus. The word Tsar was the Slavonic rendering of Caesar, the title of the Roman emperors. Its adoption announced to the world that the ruler of Moscow claimed the imperial inheritance of Rome and Byzantium, that he stood not as the leader of a local principality, but as the sovereign of an empire, divinely ordained and answerable to no temporal authority. In the days following his coronation, a series of massive fires swept Moscow, the result, apparently, of dry conditions and an accident, though rumors attributed them to the Glinskaya family's sorcery, and triggered serious riots in which the young Tsar participated in restoring order with enough visible personal courage to establish an early reputation for decisive leadership. More significantly, the fires produced a religious reformer named Sylvester, whose dramatic appearance before Ivan during the aftermath, presenting the fires as divine punishment for the Tsar's failure to govern, justly helped catalyze the reform program of the early reign. The chosen council, the informal advisory group of reform-minded clerics, officials, and nobles, including Sylvester and the military administrator, Alexei Adashev, guided the creative phase of Ivan's governance with results that were genuinely impressive by the standards of Russian history. The Sudebnik of 1550, a comprehensive legal code, provided systematic legal standards across the realm. The Zemsky Sobor of 1549, an assembly of representatives from across Russian society, including clergy, nobility, and townspeople, was convened to discuss reform, representing the closest approach to representative governance that Russia had yet produced. The Streltsy, a permanent corps of musketeers armed with firearms and paid by the state, created the foundation for a standing army under direct royal control, rather than dependent on the military service of unreliable nobles. These were genuine, lasting institutional reforms. The conquests of the early reign added territory and symbolic importance to the institutional achievements. The Khanate of Kazan, the Tatar Muslim successor state to the Golden Horde that had dominated Russia for 2 centuries, sitting on the Upper Volga and regularly raiding Russian territories for slaves and tribute, was conquered after a siege of extraordinary logistical complexity in October 1552. The victory was celebrated as the final triumph over the Mongol domination that had shaped Russian political culture since the 13th century, and to commemorate it, Ivan commissioned the construction of the Cathedral of the Core Intercession on the Red Square Moat, the building the world knows as St. Basil's Cathedral. Its extraordinary polychrome onion domes, a visible expression of Russian thanksgiving for military victory. The Khanate of Astrakhan followed in 1556, giving Russia control of the entire Volga, from its source to the Caspian Sea, and opening the commercial and strategic routes into Central Asia. But the turning point came in 1560, with the death of Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan's first wife, and, by every account including his own, the person who had provided the emotional stability, without which his personality was unable to function within normal limits. Anastasia came from a respectable, but not particularly powerful boyar family, and in the deeply hierarchical social world of the Moscow court, her position was therefore not politically threatening. She appears to have genuinely calmed something in Ivan's character. The contemporary observations of her calming influence on the Tsar have the ring of authentic testimony rather than formulaic praise. Whether she died of illness or was deliberately poisoned by boyar rivals who recognized her moderating function is genuinely uncertain. What is certain is Ivan's conviction that she had been murdered, and the paranoid logic that led him from that conviction to a general belief that the entire boyar class was engaged in a conspiracy against him and against his dynasty. The oprichnina, the word, comes from the Old Russian oprich, meaning apart or outside, was the institutional expression of that paranoia. Announced in a theatrical display of apparent abdication in January 1565, Ivan withdrew to the monastery of Alexandrovskaya Sloboda and sent messages to Moscow declaring that he was abdicating because of the treachery of the boyars. The oprichnina divided Russia into two administrative spheres. The larger portion, the zemskina, continued under traditional administration. The smaller but economically vital portion, the oprichnina, became Ivan's personal domain, governed directly by him through a new corps of enforcers answerable only to the Tsar. The oprichniki, Ivan's personal servants within the oprichnina, were selected from outside the traditional boyar class, deliberately chosen to owe their position entirely to the Tsar's personal favor, rather than to hereditary standing. They wore black, rode black horses, and carried at their saddles severed dogs' heads, representing their duty to sniff out treason, and brooms, representing their duty to sweep it away. They functioned as a combination of political police, death squad, and economic predator, confiscating estates from designated enemies, torturing and executing real or imagined opponents of the Tsar, and generally establishing through the most visceral possible means the principle that no wealth, no status, and no racial safety existed outside the shelter of the Tsar's favor. The most catastrophic single operation of the oprichniki came in 1570, directed against the city of Novgorod. Novgorod, one of the oldest and most prosperous cities in Russia, a former member of the Hanseatic League with trading connections stretching across northern Europe, a city of genuine commercial and cultural sophistication, was accused of conspiring with Lithuania and Poland-Lithuania. Ivan descended on the city in January with an oprichniki force and conducted a purge that lasted approximately 6 weeks. The death toll estimates range from 2,000 to 60,000, the enormous spread reflecting both the genuine uncertainty of the sources and the difficulty of counting deaths that resulted from a combination of direct execution, mass drowning in the Volkhov River, and the famine and disease that followed the systematic destruction of the city's economic infrastructure. By any estimate, the massacre was one of the largest acts of internal state violence in medieval European history. Ivan's personal cruelty reached its most famous and most psychologically devastating expression in November 1581, when during a violent argument with his son and heir Ivan Ivanovich, the argument was apparently about the appearance of Ivan Ivanovich's pregnant wife, whose dress Ivan the Tsar found inappropriately revealing the Tsar struck his son on the head with his iron-tipped staff. The blow caused a fatal skull fracture. Ivan Ivanovich died 4 days later. Ivan the Tsar, reportedly overcome by horror at what he had done, cradled his son's body and wept with a grief that was clearly genuine, but the succession crisis he had created by destroying the ablest and most politically capable of his sons was real and irreversible. He died on March 18, 1584, while setting up chess pieces for a game in his Moscow apartments. The throne passed to his remaining son Fyodor, a man of deep personal piety but limited political ability who was essentially incapable of governing the complex empire his father had created. The crisis of the succession, combined with the economic devastation that the oprichnina's property seizures and the ongoing Livonian War had inflicted on the Russian countryside, produced the catastrophic period known as the Time of Troubles, Smutnoye Vremya, that followed Fyodor's death in 1598. Years of famine, civil war, foreign invasion, and the near destruction of the state Ivan had built. His epithet Grozny in Russian is commonly translated as the Terrible in English, but the Russian word carries a different range of meaning than the English translation suggests. Grozny implies awe-inspiring, formidable, dread-inducing power, the terrible in the sense of provoking terror, but also in the sense of inspiring awe at a force beyond normal human scale. Ivan was all of these things simultaneously. The builder who created Russian imperial identity and expanded its territory beyond anything his predecessors had achieved, and the destroyer who, in pursuing absolute security, created catastrophic insecurity, who in seeking to protect his dynasty destroyed its capacity for continuation, who in seeking to establish autocracy created the conditions for autocracy's most catastrophic failure. Are you listening from Russia, Eastern Europe, or somewhere entirely different? Drop your city and local time in the comments. We love connecting with our audience around the world. In the early 16th century, Northern Europe was a region of constantly shifting political alliances, fragile dynastic unions, and the kind of aristocratic ambition that made stable governance perpetually precarious. The Kalmar Union, the political arrangement that had theoretically united the three Scandinavian kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown since 1397, was in practice a sustained political crisis, with Sweden regularly asserting its effective independence from Danish dominance. The Swedish aristocracy and church viewing Danish royal authority as illegitimate foreign imposition rather than rightful rule. Christian II inherited this unstable legacy when he became King of Denmark and Norway in 1513 at the age of 31. He was the son of King Hans, who had himself spent considerable energy attempting to maintain the Kalmar Union against Swedish resistance. Christian inherited both the claim and the ambition, combined with a personality that mixed genuine reforming instincts, a desire to reduce noble power and protect the rights of common people and townspeople, with a ruthlessness in pursuit of his objectives that would prove catastrophically self-defeating. His marriage to Isabella of Austria, the sister of the future Emperor Charles V and the granddaughter of both Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, tied him to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, theoretically providing him with the kind of international backing that company would reinforce his ambitions in Scandinavia. But Christian's personal, emotional life complicated this diplomatic asset. His long-standing relationship with Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, a Dutch commoner from Bergen, whose mother Sigbrit Willems became one of Christian's most influential advisors, scandalized the Danish and Norwegian nobility, who despised the presence of foreign women of low birth wielding political influence at the court of a king who had an Austrian archduchess as his legitimate consort. The campaign to force Sweden's submission that Christian launched in 1520 succeeded militarily, his forces, fighting their way into central Sweden against determined resistance, captured Stockholm in September, and Christian was crowned King of Sweden in November. But the political aftermath of that apparent success produced the event that defined his reign's historical meaning and destroyed any prospect of its long-term success. In the days following his Swedish coronation, Christian invited the Swedish nobility, clergy, and prominent citizens to a coronation celebration in Stockholm. The feast lasted several days. Then, on November 7th and 8th, 1520, the festival turned into a tribunal, and the tribunal into a massacre. Christian had obtained a declaration from his ecclesiastical advisors that the individuals who had resisted his rule were guilty of heresy, a legal maneuver that superseded the safe conduct guarantees he had previously issued, and that placed the accused outside normal legal protection. Approximately 80 to 90 prominent Swedes, bishops, nobles, burghers, leading figures of Stockholm society, were arrested, tried, and executed over 2 days in the central square of Stockholm. Their bodies were subsequently burned, and the remains of previously deceased opponents were exhumed and burned as well, in a demonstration of thoroughness that seemed designed to erase not merely opponents, but the memory of opposition. The Stockholm Bloodbath, as it immediately became known, achieved the opposite of what Christian intended. Rather than eliminating the leadership of Swedish resistance, it guaranteed that the next generation of Swedish opposition would be unified, implacable, and grounded in a sense of grievance so profound that no subsequent Danish concession could address it. Gustav Eriksson Vasa, whose father was among those executed in the Bloodbath, escaped from Danish captivity, raised a rebellion in the Swedish province of Dalarna, inspiring the peasants of that region with a cross-country ski journey that the Swedish tradition commemorates annually in the Vasala pit race, and within 3 years had driven the Danish forces from Sweden and been elected Swedish king. The Kalmar Union was finished. Sweden's independence, formally established in 1523, would prove permanent. Back in Denmark and Norway, Christian's position collapsed equally rapidly. His reliance on non-noble advisors like Sigbrit Willems, his legislation protecting peasants and townspeople against noble exploitation, and the uncontrollable association of his name with the Stockholm massacre all combined to alienate the Danish and Norwegian nobility beyond reconciliation. His uncle Frederick of Holstein, who had every dynastic reason to position himself as the alternative to Christian, was available as a credible replacement. In January 1523, Christian was forced to flee Denmark with his family, sailing into exile with a fleet loaded with whatever royal treasure he had been able to take. He would spend 8 years as an exile in the Netherlands under the intermittent and inadequate protection of his Habsburg brother-in-law, Charles V, attempting to mount a return expedition and finding little sustained support from any of the powers whose backing might have made such an expedition viable. His attempted return in 1531, landing in Norway with a small fleet and initially receiving some support, ended in surrender in 1532 under a safe conduct guarantee that was immediately violated. He was imprisoned, spending the remainder of his life in confinement, first in the castle of Sonderborg on the island of Als, where for the first 17 years he was kept in genuinely harsh conditions, and then in the somewhat more comfortable surroundings of Kalundborg Castle until his death in 1559. The legend that he wore grooves in the floor of his prison cell by pacing compulsively in circles for decades may or may not be literally accurate, but it captures the image of a king reduced from ambition to monotony, from the attempted conquest of 3 kingdoms to the endless circuit of a single room. His legacy is precisely the divided assessment that his ambition and his cruelty produced. To the common people of Denmark and the Netherlands, who remembered his protective legislation, he was Christian the Merciful, a king who had tried to defend the weak against the powerful and who had been destroyed by those same powerful interests. To Sweden and to the Norse nobility, he was Christian the Tyrant, the man who had invited guests to a coronation and murdered them at the feast, whose name became synonymous with the betrayal of hospitality and the abuse of sovereign power. Richard II came to the throne of England as a child of 10 years old in June 1377, following the death of his grandfather, Edward III, the long-reigning king under whom England had achieved military glories at Crécy, Poitiers, and across the Channel that had made the English crown the most militarily prestigious in Western Europe. Richard's father, Edward the Black Prince, the legendary warrior prince who had been widely expected to become one of England's greatest kings, had died the previous year without ever ascending the throne. Richard's claim was therefore secure and dynastic, but his position was from the first complicated by the fact that he was succeeding a legendary reign without the personal experience or political capital that might have allowed him to navigate the powerful personalities who surrounded the throne of a 10-year-old king. The world he inherited was already trembling with unresolved tensions. Taxation for the French wars had been heavy and increasingly resented. The social hierarchy was under pressure from below. The Black Death's demographic revolution had improved the bargaining position of surviving laborers and generated conflict between lords who wanted to maintain pre-plague labor arrangements and workers who recognized that their scarcity had changed their leverage. Religious dissent was stirring around the teachings of John Wycliffe, whose challenge to clerical wealth and his doctrine that the Bible, rather than the church hierarchy, was the ultimate religious authority, was gaining adherents among both the educated clergy and the literate laity. 4 years into Richard's reign, in the summer of 1381, these tensions exploded in the peasants' revolt, the most significant popular uprising in medieval English history. Beginning in Essex and Kent, spreading rapidly to encompass much of southern England, the revolt brought approximately 60,000 angry men, mostly peasants, artisans, and minor townspeople, to the outskirts of London. Their demands were specific and radical: the abolition of serfdom, the removal of various oppressive officials, and the punishment of those they blamed for the oppressive taxation of the preceding decade. They burned John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace. They occupied the Tower of London and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Treasurer. At Smithfield on June 15, 1381, the 14-year-old Richard rode out to meet the rebels personally, a gesture of personal courage that, whatever its political calculation, was genuinely remarkable for a boy of his age, facing an armed crowd of tens of thousands. When Wat Tyler, the rebel leader, was killed in the confusion of the parley by the mayor of London, Richard immediately rode forward before the crowd could react, declaring himself their leader and their king, ordering them to follow him. The gesture, audacious, instinctive, perfectly calibrated to the moment, dissipated the immediate crisis. The rebels dispersed. It was perhaps the finest moment of Richard's reign. The tragedy is that the qualities it demonstrated, boldness, instinctive understanding of symbolic gesture, personal courage, were qualities that Richard possessed genuinely, but that were fatally undermined by the contradictory aspects of his character that would ultimately destroy his kingship. As Richard grew into his 20s, the court he created around himself became increasingly a sealed environment of flattery and aesthetic indulgence that insulated him from the political realities of the kingdom he was supposed to govern. He was genuinely and seriously interested in art, architecture, and the literary culture of his age. His court produced Geoffrey Chaucer, who served the crown in various administrative capacities while writing the Canterbury Tales. His kitchen staff produced the Form of Curry, the oldest known English cookbook. His building programs left the magnificent hammer-beam roof of Westminster Hall as a permanent monument. He was a genuine patron of culture in ways that his warrior predecessors had not been. But his investment in the cultural and ceremonial apparatus of kingship, in the divine mystery of royal majesty, in the ritual distance between the king and his subjects, in the physical splendor and elaborate protocol of the royal household, was not matched by any corresponding engagement with the practical governance that medieval kingship required. He believed, with a depth of conviction that prevented him from recognizing its political danger, in the absolute divine right of kings, the doctrine that royal authority was sacred, unchallengeable, and accountable only to God. In an age when the English nobility maintained an equally firm conviction that kings governed through consent and counsel rather than by arbitrary will, this belief was less a theological position than a political time bomb. The clash with the Lords Appellant, the coalition of powerful nobles, led by the Duke of Gloucester and the Earl Estey of Warwick and Arundel, who challenged Richard's governance and forced the merciless Parliament of 1388 on him, executing his favourites and humiliating him politically in ways he never forgot and never forgave, was the defining crisis of his early reign. Richard endured the humiliation with outward compliance and inward rage. He waited. He planned. He rebuilt his political position carefully across the early 1390s. appearing to reconcile with his opponents, while privately nursing his resentment. In 1397, he struck. With the precision of a man who has been calculating his revenge for years, he arrested Gloucester, Warwick, and Arundel simultaneously. Arundel was executed. Warwick was exiled to the Isle of Man. Gloucester died in custody in Calais. The official account was illness, but contemporaries and subsequent historians alike have found the convenience of the timing deeply suspicious. The message was clear. The king had a long memory and an unforgiving temperament. The treatment of Henry Bolingbroke, Henry of Lancaster, son of John of Gaunt, the most powerful magnate in England, provided the final impetus for the dynasty's destruction. When Henry and Thomas Mowbray quarrelled, Richard first imposed exile on both men, Henry for 10 years, Mowbray for life, and then, when John of Gaunt died in February 1399, Richard seized the entire Lancastrian inheritance rather than allowing Henry to return from exile to take it. The seizure was technically legal under certain readings of feudal law. It was politically catastrophic. Every major landholding family in England understood that if the king could confiscate the inheritance of Lancaster without legal challenge, no one's estates were safe. Henry's cause became every baron's cause. Henry returned to England in July 1999 while Richard was in Ireland conducting a military campaign. The support he accumulated was so rapid and so complete that by the time Richard returned, there was effectively no Ricardian party left. Richard surrendered at Flint Castle in August. He was compelled to abdicate in September at a parliamentary session in Westminster Hall, reportedly reading aloud a prepared text acknowledging his own incapacity to govern and formally renouncing the crown. Henry Bolingbroke was acclaimed King Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle. He died there in February 1400, the exact manner of his death remaining, as the medieval phrase had it, uncertain, though the most probable explanation is deliberate starvation, whether actively imposed or the result of Richard's own refusal to eat in passive protest. He was 33 years old. His reign stands as one of the clearest illustrations in English history of how the personal qualities of a ruler can determine the political fate of a kingdom, and of how the qualities that make a great patron of culture do not necessarily translate into the qualities that make an effective governor of men. When Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, one of the most accomplished and capable rulers of medieval Europe, the founder of Prague University, the builder of Charles Bridge, and the Gothic splendor of St. Vitus Cathedral, the architect of the Golden Bull of 1356 that stabilized imperial electoral procedures, died in November 1378. The position of King of the Romans passed to his eldest son Wenceslaus. At 17 years old, inheriting both the Bohemian crown and the dignity that was meant to lead to imperial coronation, Wenceslaus carried the weight of his father's extraordinary legacy alongside the entirely different character of his own personality. Charles IV had governed through careful, patient diplomacy, building alliances, resolving disputes, managing the fractious princes of the empire through a combination of expertise and practical generosity. He had made Prague one of the most culturally sophisticated cities north of the Alps. He had given Bohemia decades of stability and prosperity. The contrast between father and son, as it manifested over the following years, became one of the starkest in the history of medieval German governance. Wenceslaus was not unintelligent. Contemporary accounts suggest he was capable of genuine insight when he chose to apply himself, but he rarely chose to. The governance of Bohemia, and the even more demanding governance of the empire, which required constant travel, constant arbitration between competing princely interests, constant attention to the disputes that threatened imperial peace, demanded exactly the qualities that Wenceslaus found most burdensome: sustained attention, reliable availability, willingness to be bored by the practical details of administration. He preferred hunting, feasting, and the company of personal friends whose principal qualifications was their ability to provide entertainment rather than their capacity for wise counsel. The chroniclers of his reign, writing with the unsympathetic perspective of clergy and nobles who found his behavior not merely personally objectionable but professionally incompetent, describe a king who failed to appear at imperial diets when his presence was essential for resolving disputes, who ignored petitions that accumulated in royal offices because he had not bothered to read them, who dissolved court sessions without notice because he had decided that the afternoon was better spent elsewhere, who preferred the company of his court jester and his dogs to the company of bishops and princes, whose solution to the problem of being confronted with a demand for justice he found inconvenient was to remove himself from proximity to the demand rather than to address it. The practical consequences were serious. The empire, always a delicate balance of competing interests, requiring an active ninth engaged emperor to prevent the centrifugal forces of princely autonomy from tearing the whole structure apart, began to fragment. Feuds between princes escalated without imperial arbitration. Banditry flourished on the roads of Germany because the emperor who was supposed to enforce imperial peace was not interested in doing so. The great merchant cities of the empire, whose trade required secure roads, suffered measurably from the neglect of imperial justice. The Great Schism of 1378, the division of the Catholic Church between a Roman Pope, Urban VI, and an Avignon Pope, Clement VII, each excommunicating the other, and their respective supporters, created a crisis that cried out for active imperial engagement. Charles IV had been a skilled diplomatic manager of papal relations. Wenceslaus offered nothing but inaction. The schism, without imperial intervention to resolve it, deepened and extended, contributing to the spiritual and institutional crisis of the late medieval church on which the Protestant Reformation would eventually emerge. The murder of John of Nepomuk in 1393 brought his personal cruelty to a level of notoriety that survived his reign by centuries. John, a priest serving as vicar general for the Archbishop of Prague, refused the king's demand that he reveal the contents of Queen Sophia's confession. Whether Wenceslaus was seeking evidence of marital infidelity or was simply exercising his perceived right to know anything he wished to know is unclear from the sources. What is clear is that John maintained his professional and religious obligation to preserve the secrecy of the confessional. Wenceslaus had him arrested, subjected to torture, and then thrown from the Charles Bridge into the VIII River, where he drowned. John of Nepomuk was canonized in 1729. His statue now stands on Charles Bridge, alongside those of numerous other saints, and he is venerated as the patron saint of bridges, confessors, and those falsely accused, a direct consequent of Wenceslaus's act. Wenceslaus, meanwhile, is remembered as the king who murdered a priest for refusing to betray the sanctity of confession. The formal deposition of 1400 was unprecedented in its clarity. The electoral princes of the empire, the 7 rulers whose votes determined the imperial succession, gathered and formally declared Wenceslaus deposed as king of the Romans, citing his idleness, sloth, and notorious uselessness. In his place, they elected Rupert of the Palatinate. Wenceslaus refused to acknowledge the deposition and continued claiming the title from Bohemia, where he retained the Bohemian crown, but no serious political actor treated his imperial claims as meaningful after 1400. He died in 1419, leaving Bohemia in the early stages of the Hussite religious revolution, the movement inspired by the execution of Jan Hus at the Council of Constance in 1415, itself a consequence of the unresolved church crisis that Wenceslaus's inaction had allowed to fester. The U.S. site wars that consumed Bohemia for the following 15 years were, in significant measure, the harvest of seeds planted by a king too indifferent to govern. Henry VIII came to the throne of England on April 22, 1509, the day of his father, Henry VII's death, at the age of 17 years and 10 months. He came to it as perhaps the most physically impressive young prince in Europe, 6 feet 2 inches tall in an age when the average male height was approximately 5 feet 7, broad-shouldered and athletic, with the reddish-gold hair and fair complexion of the Welsh Tudor line, trained in every discipline that humanist education and aristocratic accomplishment required. He spoke Latin, French, and Spanish. He played the lute, the organ, and the virginal with genuine skill. He had studied theology with sufficient seriousness to earn the praise of Erasmus, who visited England in his early reign and wrote with apparently genuine admiration of the young king's intellectual range. The accession of Henry VIII produced in the English court and among the educated classes of England a wave of genuine, articulate enthusiasm that goes beyond the formulaic praise that every new reign routinely generated. His father, Henry VII, had been effective, disciplined, financially prudent, institutionally capable, but grey. He had built a dynasty from nothing following the chaos of the Wars of the Roses, established the Tudor claim to the crown against all challenges, and left his son a kingdom that was solvent, peaceful, and administratively coherent. But his reign had been experienced as something between austere and oppressive, marked by the aggressive use of financial penalties and the activities of his hated financial agents, Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson. When Henry VII died, Dudley and Empson were arrested within days, eventually executed, offering a symbolic break with the preceding era that the new king's supporters enthusiastically welcomed. Henry VIII, by contrast, made to embody everything that a Renaissance prince should be: the living proof that monarchy and cultivation, power and beauty, authority and intellectual refinement could coexist in a single magnificent person. The court he assembled around himself in the first years of his reign was one of the most culturally brilliant in English history, attracting not merely domestic talent but the finest humanist minds of Europe, with Thomas More, the most celebrated English scholar and lawyer of his generation, serving as the king's closest intellectual companion and eventually as Lord Chancellor. The deterioration of this promising beginning into something much darker was not instantaneous. It occurred over decades, through an accumulation of disappointments, resentments, and the progressive hardening of personality that absolute power tends to produce in individuals who are not constrained by institutional limits or by the genuinely internalized values that might make those limits unnecessary. The early Henry jousting, dancing, composing music, discussing theology was a real person with real gifts and real capacity for generosity. The later Henry swollen, ulcerated, suspicious, dispatching friends and wives to the scaffold with equal facility, was also a real person, and the path between the two was not a rupture but a progression. The consuming obsession with male succession that drove the central crisis of his reign was not in itself unreasonable from the perspective of 16th-century dynastic politics. Tudor rule had been established by force and maintained by Henry VII's organizational genius for just over 2 decades when Henry VIII took the throne. Its hold on legitimacy was secure enough, but the dynasty had no reserve of the deep historical roots that made the Capetians or the Habsburgs more or less inevitable. A disputed succession, a teenage girl on the throne, or competing claimants from the Plantagenet line could genuinely have unraveled everything. Henry V, too, had built. Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had been Henry VIII's first wife, initially married to his older brother Arthur before Arthur's death in 1502 at the age of 15, then betrothed to Henry himself as the most convenient solution to the political and financial complications of returning her to Spain, had given Henry 6 pregnancies between 1510 and 1518. Only one child, Princess Mary, born in 1516, had survived more than a few weeks. By the mid-15th century, Catherine was approaching 40. the probability of further successful pregnancies was declining, and Henry's political anxiety about the succession was sharpening into personal urgency. Theological argument he developed that his marriage to Catherine had been invalid from its inception because she had been his brother's wife, and that the Levitical prohibition of such unions meant that God had denied him male heirs as punishment, was not intellectually absurd by the standards of 16th century biblical interpretation, though it was selectively applied. The same book of Leviticus that Henry cited also contained provisions in Deuteronomy requiring a man to marry his deceased brother's widow, and Catherine's lawyers made effective use of this contradiction. What made Henry's campaign for annulment politically explosive was that Catherine happened to be the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, whose armies had sacked Rome in 1527, and who effectively held Pope Clement VII under military pressure. The Pope was not in a position to grant an annulment that would humiliate the most powerful ruler in Europe. The 6-year attempt to secure the annulment through ecclesiastical channels from 1527, when Henry first raised the question officially, to 1533, when Thomas Cranmer, as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, simply declared the marriage null and void on Henry's authority produced, as the byproduct of frustrated impatience meeting absolute power, the English Reformation. The Act of Supremacy of 1534, declaring Henry the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, was the legal instrument of a break with Rome that had been driven not primarily by theology. Henry remained, in his own mind, a conservative Catholic on most doctrinal questions for the rest of his life, but by the pragmatic necessity of removing the one institution whose authority stood between him and the marital resolution he wanted. The dissolution of the monasteries, the confiscation of approximately 900 monastic institutions' lands, buildings, valuables, and incomes between 1536 and 1541, under the administrative direction of Thomas Cromwell, was both the fiscal fall that financed Henry's subsequent military adventures and the most thoroughgoing redistribution of landed property in England since the Norman conquest. The social, cultural, and religious disruption was enormous. The monasteries had been the primary providers of hospitality to travelers, education to local communities, charitable assistance to the poor, and care for the sick in medieval England. Their dissolution removed these functions without providing anything to replace them, and the lands that were distributed to the Crown's supporters, and that quickly filtered out to the wider gentry class through subsequent sales, created a powerful new interest group with strong material reasons to support the break with Rome and oppose any Catholic restoration. The 6 queens of Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr are the most famous aspect of his personal life, and the aspect that has most shaped subsequent popular understanding of him. The relevant statistics are stark. Of the 6, 2 were executed on his orders. Anne Boleyn in 1536, on charges of adultery and conspiracy that most modern historians regard as fabricated, and Catherine Howard in 1542, on charges of premarital sexual activity that were more credibly founded, though the execution of a teenager for this offense tells its own story. One died in childbirth, Jane Seymour, in 1537, the only wife Henry apparently mourned with genuine grief. One was diplomatically discarded within 6 months of a marriage that had been arranged for political reasons and that Henry found personally unsatisfying. Anne of Cleves in 1540, shortly before Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, was sent to the scaffold, and the last outlived him. The executions of the men who had served him most ably: Thomas More, in 1535, for refusing to swear to the Act of Supremacy; Thomas Cromwell, in 1540, for a combination of the Anne of Cleves fiasco and the accumulated enmity of the court faction that had turned Henry against him; Thomas Cranmer, was kept alive only because Henry valued his theological flexibility. Though his fate under Mary's subsequent reign was no less violent, demonstrate the reign's defining pattern. Loyalty and service provided no protection against the consequences of displeasing a king for whom displeasure translated naturally into a death sentence. His physical decay in the last decade of his reign matched the moral decay of his governance. The athletic young man who had jousted and danced with equal distinction became, by his 40s, massively obese. His waist measurement, recorded in the Royal Armour Workshop as expanding from approximately 32 inches in 1512 to approximately 54 inches by 1540. An old tournament injury to his right thigh, incurred in 1536, developed into chronically infected leg ulcers that caused him constant pain, intermittent fever, and the kind of sustained physical suffering that does nothing to moderate an already difficult temperament. He required mechanical assistance to move through the palace corridors in his final years. He died in January 1547 at the age of 55, leaving behind the theological chaos of an English church that was neither Catholic nor fully reformed, a treasury exhausted by his military adventures, and 3 children whose competing claims to succeed him would keep England in religious and political crisis for a generation. The England he left behind was genuinely transformed. The monasteries were gone. The papacy's authority was abolished. The Bible was available in English, and the institutional framework for Protestant Christianity in England was in place. Whether those transformations were benefits or disasters depended entirely on which side of the religious divide one stood. What was not in question was the means by which they had been accomplished. Through the concentrated, arbitrary, ultimately personal authority of a king who treated the institutions, lives, and theological convictions of his subjects as instruments of his own will. Henry VIII was not the worst king in English history by every measure, but he was the king whose enormous gifts and absolute power combined most explosively, producing transformations of undeniable historical significance at a cost in human suffering and institutional destruction that his most admiring defenders have always had difficulty justifying. George Augustus Frederick, born on August 12, 1762, at St. James's Palace in Pray, London, entered the world as the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte, heir apparent to a kingdom that was in the process of becoming the hub of global commercial and imperial power that it would remain for the following century and a half. His birth was greeted with the celebrations appropriate to a royal heir. His prospects, on paper, were excellent. The problem was the gap between paper and reality, the difference between what George was positioned to become and what his own character allowed him to be. He was raised in a court governed by his father's stern Hanoverian morality, in which duty, discipline, and public virtue were emphasized to a degree that his mother, Queen Charlotte, apparently enforced with genuine conviction. The reaction against this upbringing, common enough in the psychology of pampered children raised under rigid moral constraints, expressed itself, in George's case, with a thoroughness and an expense that made it one of the most extensively documented cases of aristocratic self-indulgence in British history. By his 20s, the Prince of Wales had become the central figure of a court culture defined by its opposition to everything his father represented. Where George III was frugal, George was extravagant. Where his father was morally strict, George was conspicuously dissolute. Where his father identified with a conservative Anglican piety that found ostentation distasteful, George was a connoisseur of architecture, art, food, fashion, and the company of witty, morally flexible people who could appreciate his own sense of style. Carlton House, which he began remodeling in 1783, with the help of the architect Henry Holland, and subsequently with John Nash, became a statement of aesthetic ambition that consumed fortunes and generated admiring descriptions from virtually everyone who visited Weil Baal. simultaneously demonstrating that its owner had no apparent intention of allowing political responsibility to interrupt the pursuit of personal pleasure. His most scandalous early venture was the secret marriage of 1785 to Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Roman Catholic commoner whose personal character appears to have been entirely admirable and whose religious faith was entirely incompatible with the legal requirements of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the monarch's consent for members of the royal family to marry, and the Act of Settlement of 1701, which barred from the succession a body married to a Roman Catholic. The marriage was legally void from its inception. It was nonetheless conducted in secret, with Fitzherbert's insistence on a proper ceremony, representing her refusal to be merely a mistress, and George's willingness to go through the form of marriage, while knowing perfectly well it had no legal standing, which tells us something significant about the character of both parties. The openly miserable arranged marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, negotiated to provide an heir and to secure a parliamentary bailout of George's enormous accumulated debts, became one of the most public domestic disasters in British royal history. The couple's mutual dislike was apparently immediate and visceral. George was reportedly drunk at their wedding and reportedly requested wine throughout the ceremony. They separated almost immediately after their daughter Princess Charlotte's birth in 1796 and spent the rest of their lives engaged in a prolonged, mutual, grading public conflict that provided the satirical press already having a field day with George's other excesses, with material that kept pamphleteers and caricaturists busy for decades. His coronation in July 1821 was the most expensive in English history to that date, approximately £250,000, the equivalent of tens of millions in contemporary terms, featuring an elaborately choreographed ceremony with medieval-themed costumes that George had personally designed, a procession of extraordinary grandeur, and the scandalous spectacle of Queen Caroline, whom George had been trying unsuccessfully to divorce in the preceding year, and whose evident popular sympathy from the crowds made her a potent political embarrassment, attempting to enter Westminster Abbey at multiple doors and being physically turned away from each one by the doorkeepers who had been instructed to bar her. His decade as king was characterized by the same contradictions that had defined his period as Prince Regent, Prince of Wales, but in a political context that was rapidly changing around him, in ways he was temperamentally incapable of engaging with constructively. The industrialization of Britain was creating urban working-class populations whose conditions of life and whose exclusion from political representation were generating serious pressure for parliamentary reform. The Peterloo Massacre of August 1819, when cavalry of the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry charged into a crowd of approximately 60,000 people assembled on St. Peter's Field in Manchester to hear speeches demanding parliamentary reform, killing approximately 15 people and injuring hundreds, had been a defining moment of the confrontation between the established political order and the reforming movement, and George's government had congratulated the perpetrators. The Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, which removed the civil disabilities that had prevented Roman Catholics from sitting in Parliament or holding most public offices, was the major constitutional achievement of his reign, and it occurred against his personal and vocal opposition. He threatened multiple times to abdicate rather than sign it. He was persuaded to accept it only by the argument that his refusal would precipitate a constitutional crisis more damaging than the act itself. His signature on the bill that transformed the religious and political landscape of the United Kingdom was extracted by political necessity rather than offered in any spirit of genuine liberal conviction. His cultural legacy is less easy to dismiss. The buildings associated with his patronage remain among the most distinctive and admired in England. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, designed by John Nash in the extraordinary Indo-Saracenic style that George had specified, with its onion domes, minarets, and the extraordinary interior, whose rooms are among the most lavishly decorated spaces in any royal residence in Europe, is genuinely one of the most remarkable Bay buildings in Britain. Whatever one thinks of the king who commissioned it, the rebuilding of Windsor Castle, also under Nash's direction and at enormous expense, transformed it from a medieval fortress into the Victorian and Edwardian royal residence, familiar from 1,000 photographs. The layout of Regent Street and the development of Regent's Park, both Nash projects, conceived under royal patronage, shaped central London in ways that remain visible today. He died on June 26, 1830 at Windsor Castle, aged 67, after years of progressive physical decline in which his enormous weight, his gout, arteriosclerosis, and various other conditions of the wealthy and sedentary combined to reduce him to an mies, whose movements outside his private apartments had become increasingly limited. His brother, William IV, succeeded him with very little ceremony, and the British public, which had spent 30 years reading satirical accounts of George IV's excesses, greeted the accession with something closer to relief than grief. The Times, not then a paper given to excessive Republican sentiment, published a leader on the occasion of his death that began, "There never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. He was a bad king, self-indulgent, irresponsible, incapable of sustaining the duties of his position with any consistency. He was also, in the specific domain of aesthetic culture, a person of genuine achievement whose taste and patronage left a lasting positive imprint on British architecture, art collecting, and cultural life. The paradox is real and not easily resolved. What it suggests, perhaps, is that the qualities that make someone a great patron of culture and the qualities that make someone an effective governor of a complex modern state are not merely different, but almost antithetical, that the sensibility required for the one can actively undermine the capacity for the other. When the long parade of monarchs had faded into the silence of history, their crowns set aside in museum display cases, their palaces converted to tourist attractions, their edicts dissolved by the passage of centuries, what lingers is not the weight of their titles. What lingers is the weight of their choices. Across millennia and across continents, kings rose and fell, their power shaped by ambition, paranoia, indulgence, or the particular tragedy of mental illness and constitutional weakness that no individual will or courage could have overcome. Some left their kingdoms fractured in ways that took generations to heal. Others left them permanently scarred. And still others linger in historical memory, precisely as the warnings that history most needs them to be. Yet, history itself, slow, patient, morally indifferent to human preference, but eventually revealing the consequences of human choices, continues beyond all of them. The people they ruled, the cities they touched, the cultures that endured beneath, and sometimes under, despite their governance, all of these carried on, when each monarch's voice finally fell quiet. Even the worst of kings were swept away by time, leaving space for renewal, for the slow growth of institutions, stronger and more durable than any individual will, for the gradual, painful, never complete work of building political systems that could survive the failures of the individuals who happened to occupy their highest offices. From Magna Carta, forced from John's reluctant hand on a meadow by the Thames, grew the principle that kings are not above the law, a principle that eventually became the foundation of every democratic constitution in the English-speaking world. From the catastrophe of Charles VI's madness grew the recognition that monarchies needed institutional systems capable of functioning when the monarch could not recognize that contributed to the development of constitutional government across Europe. From the horror of the Stockholm bloodbath grew Swedish national identity and independence. From the tyranny of Ivan the Terrible grew the Russian understanding of autocracies, dangers and understanding paid for in blood that has never been completely forgotten. However many subsequent generations have had to learn its lessons anew. As you drift now toward rest, imagine the crowns set down in dusty halls, their jewels dim in the moonlight, their brilliance fading into stillness. The echoes of battles soften, the cries of protest quiet to the hum of distant history. The weight of power dissolves into the rhythmic turning of centuries. All rulers pass, all empires fade, yet the night remains constant, carrying each story forward into the hush of memory. Breathe gently, and let the noise of their reigns dissolve into calm. You have walked tonight through the shadows of ambition and ruin, through madness and cruelty, through the spectacular collapse of men who held everything and could not hold themselves. The stories are told, the lessons are offered. Settle now into silence, assured that the world moves always onward, leaving behind the turmoil of failed kings, carrying forward the quiet, stubborn, endlessly renewable work of human civilization. Rest as the centuries close around you. Let sleep carry you gently forward. Before you go, drop your current city or country in the comments below and tell us what time it is where you are. We love knowing exactly where in the world our legacy of throne family is listening from tonight. If you enjoyed this journey through the worst kings in history, please like and subscribe. It means everything to us and helps more history lovers find their way here. We will see you on the next journey.